Well, good morning. It is good to see you all if we haven't met before. My name is Maggie, and I'm on the team here. I'm married to Rob, our lead pastor, and it has been an amazing week around here. I know so many of you have been involved in our gear project next door, where we've been flipping our kids and youth spaces, and we've been painting and preparing really for Easter is a big deal that we're preparing for, but also just for every week, because we want all the kids and youth that come through our doors to know that this is a place where they are welcome, where we care about them, and we just want to provide them an awesome experience where they can encounter Jesus. So thank you so much to those of you who have spent many hours helping us out over there. It is looking amazing, and if you haven't seen it at all, I encourage you to go over there, check it out. It's looking great. We're really excited for what's coming, but we're not done yet. More projects to come, but it'll be done really soon. Well, if you've been with us a while, you know that we're in a series called Restored, the Path to All Things New. A few weeks ago, we started off with Jesus as a 12-year-old and how he had to be in his father's house, and we've looked at his baptism, his temptation out in the wilderness, and we've been going through some of the miracles that Jesus did. And today's title is Desire, Desperation, and Deliverance. And that kind of gives us a roadmap for the story that we will be going through today. Well, as I was trying to think about a story maybe from my own life that can kind of connect to this theme of desire and desperation, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that the story that came to my mind was the story of my first kiss. Okay, so let me paint the stage, all right? So I'm 17, I'm a senior in high school, and I've just started dating the most amazing guy. He's a 10, okay? It's really like Zac Efron from High School Musical in real life. It was amazing. He was musical and athletic. He was an all-state running back, and he just did all the things, and he loved Jesus. And he was a little bit older than me. He was in college, and I'm thinking, how did I end up here with this guy? I can't believe it. And we've gone on a couple dates, and this particular date, we are hiking Spencer's Butte outside of Eugene, Oregon, if you've ever been there. And up Spencer's Butte the whole way, this guy is going man, wouldn't it have been great if we'd have brought a picnic? Or wouldn't it have been great if we had something to drink when we get to the top? Well, of course, when we get to the top of Spencer's Butte, he had already hiked it that morning and hidden a whole picnic. It was so precious. And so we're sitting there, and he asked me to be his girlfriend, and I say yes. And then he kisses me on the cheek, and I was like, well, that was almost my first kiss. I said those words out loud. I can't believe I said those words out loud. We're sitting there, he gives me a nice kiss on the cheek. Well, that was almost my first kiss, is what I say. I can't believe it still. I cringe when I think about it. But anyway, then he kissed me for real, and he must have thought I was cute, because 15 years later, we're still together. But desire and desperation, right? We desire a lot of things in life. We desire relationships. We desire health. We desire promotion. We desire many different things, but I think there's certain times where things that we desire can over time become a desperate need. Desire's a better word, right? We can connect with desire. It's a wish or a want. It has a lot more of a positive connotation, but desperate, that's not a very fun word. That's a lot more of a negative connotation, because it means we have a great need for something. But sometimes what we desire can turn into feeling desperate. And we're going to look at two characters in a story today that become desperate. They have a real need. They need some intervention. And our story today comes out of Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. It says, Jesus got into the boat again. So this is piggybacking immediately on what Rob preached on last week, where he set free the demon-possessed man. Okay, so this is happening right after that. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her. Heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. Jairus desired health in his family, right? He probably led his family in a way that represented having a peaceful, healthy, happy home, but now he's reached a disaster. His daughter is on the brink of death, and he is desperate. Kind of a side thought here is Jesus is in the middle of a journey, right? But he's interruptible here. Jesus hears Jairus' request. Jesus is not beyond being interrupted. And I think that that's something we have to remember about Jesus, that nothing is too big or too small, that he cares about all of it. And I think we can turn that thought on ourselves sometimes too and just wonder, are we interruptible as we go throughout our lives? Especially those of us who know Jesus well, are we interruptible to someone who may be in our life who has a need? But continuing on with the story at 25, a woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. And immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she was healed of her terrible condition. The woman desired health as well. She desired health. She'd spent years with a condition where she'd sought doctors, she sought medical advice, and no one had a solution. And she reaches a point of desperation. She needs a solution now. To compare the two characters a little bit, Jairus is well known. He's a leader of the synagogue, so that means all the Jews in the community were familiar with who he was, while the woman in the story is completely anonymous. Jairus is probably pretty wealthy, but the woman is living in poverty. Jairus is a leader, but the woman, because of her condition, could not have even entered the synagogue. But because of her condition, her bleeding, she was considered ceremonially unclean, and she could not ever get clean because her condition was constant. So she is an outcast in this society. Jairus had a happy family for 12 years until this tragedy comes in his life. And for the past 12 years for the woman, she just lived in misery, not knowing if she would ever be healed again. They're very polar life experiences, different ends of the spectrum, but both hit a point of desperation where they need Jesus. They need some intervention. And maybe you can relate to one of those characters. Maybe, though, for you, life is a little bit more like Jairus pre-tragedy. You know, things are going pretty well in life. Nothing is really needing your attention. You might desire some things, but you wouldn't say you're in a state of desperation. Or maybe you have faced a moment like Jairus in the story where suddenly it felt like everything has crumbled around you. Or maybe you relate more to the woman, where you feel like you've just gone through an endless stream of disappointment for years. Desperation can lead us to feeling like we're in a state of despair. And what is despair? Despair is the feeling that there's no hope, that you can do nothing to improve a difficult or worrying situation. And I think what's interesting about that definition is the word you. And I'm going to read that again. It's the feeling that there's no hope and that you can do nothing to improve a difficult or worrying situation. And I think it's interesting that we can't always be our own answer. We are limited. We will hit a point where we can't solve all the things because us plus us can't really achieve more. We're limited. We're finite. It's kind of like thinking of a math equation where -2 plus -2, what does that get you? -4. You're further away from a whole number, not closer to where you were. But it's hard because modern psychology and so many messages tell us to just look inside. Just look inside, follow our heart, look inside, we'll find the answer. You know, I have little boys, so that means we watch The Sandlot a lot, which I'm okay with. I love that movie. But there's that point, you know, at the end of the movie, if you've seen The Sandlot, where Benny the Jet Rodriguez is in his bedroom, and he has a dream. And in the dream, Babe Ruth appears to him. And he gives him like the answer to this problem they have with the baseball over the fence. And he's like, follow your heart, kid. It'll never steer you wrong. But I'm always like telling my boys, no, like don't follow your heart. It's not good. You got to follow Jesus. But you know, movies, everything tells us to follow our heart. But the thing that can fill us, the thing that meets our desires and helps us overcome our desperation or our despair is Jesus. Despair drives us to look beyond ourselves. So if we're driven to look beyond ourselves, we're supposed to look at Jesus. But unfortunately, you know, sometimes as humans, we spend our time looking so many other places before we turn to Jesus. But point number one for today, if you haven't guessed, is Jesus is the answer. You know, when I was working on this, a song kept coming to my head because I'm a child of the 90s, and it's the Jesus is the answer for the world today. I love him, there's no other. Jesus is the way. And you know, if you've been around church for a while, that might be a familiar song to you. And I think sometimes we hear Jesus is the answer, and we're like, I know, I've been around. I get the Sunday school answer, Jesus is the answer. But sometimes we need to let that sink into our heart a little bit more, because it's not just a cliche. It's critical. It's not just passé, it's powerful. It's not just Hobby Lobby wall decor, but hope for a dying and broken world. That Jesus is the answer. And why do we avoid that sometimes? You know, why do we avoid letting Jesus be the answer? I was rereading a couple C.S. Lewis books this week, not like the Chronicles of Narnia. If you've never read some of his other writings, he has some great essays on like Christian thought. And in The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis uses this example that kind of, I think, captures us as modern humans sometimes, where he says, we regard God as an airman regards his parachute, that it's there for emergencies, but he hopes he'll never have to use it. It's like, ooh, how many times, you know, do we wander through life as kind of Jesus is the emergency parachute? And I'm not really engaging with him on a regular basis. Though I would have to say that modern statistics on depression, anxiety lead me to believe that us as humans really aren't as self-sufficient as we like to think we are sometimes. And Jesus really wants to be more than just an emergency parachute in our lives. He wants to be in it with us, in relationship with us, because he cares about all of it. He's so much more than just a good backup plan. But I love that when we do turn to Jesus, even if we haven't been walking with him a long time, even if we haven't been strong in our relationship, there's no judgment or condemnation. Let's look at how Jesus responds to the situation in Mark chapter 5. It says, Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? And his disciples looked to him, look at the crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me? The disciples are kind of like, you're crazy. There's 100 people touching you. What are you talking about? Who touched you? It says, but he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, your suffering is over. Consider her emotion in this moment. She broke so many cultural and religious rules to get to Jesus. She was doing something she wasn't supposed to do by touching all of these people, but she finds healing. And it's interesting, if we really think about the context of what she lived in, when she was considered unclean, that meant that should she have had a husband or kids, they couldn't have ate the food that she prepared. They couldn't have sat on any chair on which she sat. They couldn't have even touched her without also becoming unclean. So she really struggled for a long time. and was so desperate for the touch from Jesus. And what's awesome is we have a picture here of really Jesus showing that he is the Messiah. Because instead of the Mosaic law making Jesus unclean, Jesus makes her clean. Jesus is able to provide the healing that she needs, that he's the new way, the new covenant. That's a big statement about who Jesus is as the Savior. And I love that Jesus calls her daughter. This woman who lived in anonymity, who felt like an outcast, was given identity in this moment, in this conversation with Jesus. And I think that that's something, I don't know if that's for somebody today, but if you felt like you don't know what you're supposed to do in life, you don't know who you are in this world, you don't know what you're supposed to do, Jesus speaks an identity over you as a son or as a daughter of the King. She's not anonymous, not to Jesus. In Psalms 3:3 it says, "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts my head." And I think that's a beautiful picture of what Jesus does for this woman. He lifts her head. He gives her identity. He heals her. He restores her. But what about Jairus, right? This is all an interruption. We started our story with a different character. What's going on with him? Well, in verse 35, it says, while he, Jesus, was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now." For Jairus, desire and desperation have just become devastation. The worst news. Exactly what he feared has just happened. And I feel like if I were Jairus, I would have a lot of emotion. Just the sadness, but then also the anger. Like, Jesus, I got here first, and you took time healing this lady, and now my daughter is dead. I'd be comparing, I would be frustrated. But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus in verse 36, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." A literal translation of this is to keep on believing. Keep on believing. And our second point for today is to walk with fearless faith. To walk with fearless faith. Jairus was waiting for a miracle. He'd approached Jesus. He got some bad news that he didn't like. And he could have turned and said, never mind, Jesus. She's dead. I'm going to go on my own way without you. But Jairus keeps walking with Jesus. He keeps walking. Even in the face of the bad news, even in the face of the disappointment, he continues walking with Jesus. And some of us might be waiting on a miracle. Some of us might be unsure what we're supposed to do, but we just need to keep walking. We need to keep walking with Jesus. Continuing on in verse 37, it says, "Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. And he went inside and asked, 'Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep.' And the crowd laughed at him. But he made them all leave. And he took the girl's father and mother and 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying." So Jairus, he keeps walking. He has some fearless faith as he's going on with Jesus. And that leads me to wonder, how do we have fearless faith in our own lives? Well, I think one of the things we can glean from this text that we just read is when Jesus comes into the home and he announces that the girl is just asleep and all the people laugh at him, he sends them out. And I think one of the first things we can do to have fearless faith is to usher out the unbelief, to usher out the negative thoughts that can crowd our mind. You know, I read a quote once, I might have even been in high school, but it was like, tell the negative committee that meets inside your head to sit down and shut up. You know, it's like, I tell that to myself a lot because I can tend to run negative, and I have to silence that negativity in my brain and remember to focus on what's true. So if we usher out the negative and what's not true, we need to put something else in, right? So we need to put in the Word of God. We need to put in the truth of what God says. And I know that we talk about this every week, the importance of reading the Word, but that's because it is important. It's so fundamental to our faith, is to spend time knowing God's Word and letting it sink into our heart, and not just taking it in once, but being like the cow that chews its cud, you know, where you swallow it and you regurgitate it and you chew it some more. Yeah, but you do it and then it sticks with you and you get the nutrients, you get the good stuff, the Word, by coming back to it over and over, and that's what helps sustain us. Another thing we can do to have fearless faith is to keep a record. If you're not a journaler, a prayer journaler, it can be a great exercise to try out. I've actually journaled consistently since 3rd grade. I will be a fascinating case study for somebody when I die, because no one's reading it until then. But it's helpful. We can look back and see the journey that God has brought us on and how his faithfulness has been in our lives, just in so many places. But what about if fearless faith feels too hard? You know, what if Jairus had just not been able to handle it? What if he just felt like it was too hard? And what if he had struggled with, God, why did I have to experience this loss before I could have experienced healing? C.S. Lewis writes in A Grief Observed, if you've never read it, it's kind of his personal journey that he walks through when he loses his wife to cancer. And C.S. Lewis writes about how sometimes he felt like when he was asking, why God, why did I have to experience this loss? Why did my wife have to go through this? He wondered, does my question sound to God like I'm asking, is yellow square or circle? I just need to know, is yellow square or circle? And he writes about, he wondered if that was how his question sounded to God. And what he felt like he got as an answer was not so much a logical answer as far as A plus B equals C for why we go through things, but it was an answer of, I love you, and I see you, and I have a plan for you, and you don't see all of what's happening, but I have a plan, and I'm good, and I will work all things for good. Just trust me. You know, I had a situation in my life where I had a prayer not work out in the way that I expected to. I started off my college journey down at a very small school called Bethany University. It was the oldest AG college in our network, and I went down there because my grandpa was president at the time, so I got a full ride scholarship, so naturally that's where I'm going. But my grandpa was brought in as president to basically save the school or decide if it needed to be closed. So we all kind of knew the writing was on the wall for Bethany. There's a strong chance it wasn't going to make it. But as a student body, we would have all night prayer gatherings. People would sign up different slots to pray in the chapel just for God's intervention for our school, because this school had a rich history. I mean, the guy who started Convoy of Hope graduated from it. I mean, lots of giants of the faith had graduated from this small, obscure school. And we thought, couldn't God keep doing it? And so we prayed and we sought the Lord for intervention for our school. But it didn't come. Bethany closed. And I had to transfer to Northwest University, which I had a terrible attitude about at the time. But it ended up being good. I can't really explain it's so clear Bethany closed because of X, Y, Z, and all this happened. But I can say that I have seen good come from those of us who were there and had to go to other schools, and our stories of how God used situations, God used this new school that I was at to awaken within me desires and dreams, and to meet people who would help me on my journey to where God ultimately wanted to go. So God used an unanswered prayer for his glory. And it's hard when we walk through that, but we trust that God is good. But if you're waiting on a miracle or waiting on healing, we can find encouragement in the promise of Revelation 21:4 that he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will no longer be death. There will no longer be sorrow and anguish or crying or pain, for the former order of things has passed away. For those of us who know Jesus, we have that hope of heaven, that everything will be restored, because God works everything for good. Well, to end our story, in verse 41, it says, holding her hand, Jesus said to her, Talitha, come, which means little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. I love that Jesus meets all the needs. He heals her, and he said, give her something to eat. You know, Jesus is very practical. He cares about all the things, but also he's making it really clear she is fully alive, because you're not going to feed a dead person. He's like, she is alive. She is healed. He's affirming what happened. Both stories of our characters, Jairus and the woman, they had desires, the same desires we have for health, for a good life, and they reached that point of desperation. But they turn to Jesus in their desperation, and they find deliverance, where they're set free. And Jesus is our deliverer. That whatever we face, he's the answer. That Jesus can bring the dead to life. Jesus brings health. Jesus brings healing. He brings cleanliness to the unclean. Through salvation, he brings us to life and holiness. And purity and life radiate from him, because that is who he is. So in our lives, when we are facing these situations that maybe make us feel a little bit desperate, we got to remember to turn to Jesus. And we got to reinforce that fearless faith by cleaning out the negative, but by putting in the positive, by studying the word, by keeping a record of how God has been faithful in our life, and by continually walking like Jairus did, even in the face of hardship or negativity, to keep walking with Jesus, even if we're waiting on that miracle. You know, I do have a challenge for those of us today. For maybe you don't super relate to Jairus or the woman and feeling desperation or feeling in a state of desperation, and maybe you've known Jesus for a while. Well, I want to challenge you to be on mission this week to help create opportunities for other people to be transformed by Jesus. To remember to be a little bit interruptible. That maybe someone in your life needs hope that you have, and you can point them to the deliverer. Or maybe you don't even know the situation yet, but maybe a divine appointment will come your way, and you can be used to point somebody to the goodness of God, to the deliverer that is Jesus. So if you could grab that connection card. The connection card is one way that we respond to the truth of God's word, because we believe that truth demands a response. And the first option, as always, is you can mark to say, I choose to follow Jesus. And if that's your first time, we will follow up with you. We want to encourage you and support you in that journey. But the second box says, I feel desperate for a solution to my need. Maybe you just need to be honest and say, yeah, I have some desperation. I need Jesus to show up in this area of my life. Or maybe number 3, I choose to turn to Jesus daily as the answer. To remind yourself that yes, no matter what, Jesus is the answer. Or maybe it's number 4, I am so grateful Jesus delivered me. If you guys could go ahead and stand with me, we're going to pray, and then Rob's going to lead us again in the goodness of God, which I think is a great way to end this message, reflecting on Jesus as the answer, his goodness and his faithfulness in our lives. God, we thank you so much that we can trust you, that no matter what we face, you're good. You have a plan, and that you walk with us through whatever we're facing.